And welcome back, everybody. We are on to our next round in the presidential tiering, and we will be looking at Abraham Lincoln, Andrew Johnson, and Ulysses S. Grant today. And we'll probably be spending only time on three because these three are pretty important presidential figures. I do want to add something with our good friend President Fillmore. One of the reasons why he does kind of bump up to a C, because you could easily put him on a D, is two things he does, which are pretty decent. One is actually he is not a member of the Know Nothing Party. All right, I know he was endorsed and nominated by them, but it wasn't. He didn't seek it, so he's not a nativist in that way per se. That's just one thing, and that doesn't add or you know detract from his C. But one thing that he did do is he kind of gets a conversation going. It's not that he's using it as a bully pulpit thing, but he's actually listening to the start of women's rights issues, and he's generally favorable to them. Not he's giving lip service. At the very least, he's giving lip service to it and talking about it and looking at it favorably and understanding that you're talking about half the population. So that's another thing I didn't mention, and I just wanted to correct that and add it in. And that is, I think, what nudges him from that D to a C minus minus minus. Okay, so now we don't have a C. We don't have a D. We certainly don't have an F. We don't have a B. We have an A. Abraham Lincoln. Just tremendous president. What he faced and what he dealt with, the personal situations going on with the death of his son and a wife who was troubled, by many things, and the personal life, but then dealing with the troubles of the country and really, taking it on as his own. Um, I have. It took me some time. I would say I always knew Abraham Lincoln was important and um, a very important president. And didn't think of him. I didn't really think of presidents in terms of good or bad. I just thought of them as presidents. And honestly, there are some negatives to him, like anyone would have, and they really detracted me from understanding his greatness, which has grown and has grown. I always considered him a very important and a very good president, but the sheer greatness and magnitude of him is, up there, and um, he consistently ranks either first or second in presidencies, and I think when we're going to the S's, I think that he and Washington. I'm only going to do three, and because I don't want to have that many who are superior, because then it's no longer superior. And I might only have two. I mean, Washington and Lincoln are at key critical junctures of this nation's history. One is the founder; he sets the tone, and he's the model that other presidents, certainly until Lincoln, are being modeled on. And how would Washington have handled this? I think he would have handled it with strength, as Lincoln did. But Lincoln is also at the point where the nation has split apart. The Confederate States, they are no longer part of the United States. Now, Lincoln doesn't recognize that, and it's a brilliant and shrewd move. But practically speaking, there are two nations in this space. It's like saying I'm still married and your spouse is living apart from you, living with someone else, doing all these things. You might be married, but you're not really married. He did some things that were shrewd, that you can say are provocateur, but he had to play this correctly. He couldn't just be seen as someone coming in with a club and going after the Confederacy. that would have gotten sympathy, especially from Great Britain, who were key trade partners with the South. Um, they needed the South. They had a need, although they had, tremendous amount, they were getting tremendous amount of cotton from India and from Egypt. And they had been for years in the 1840s trying to become less reliant on Southern United States as a trade partner because they see which way the wind is blowing. So they had really upped their trade from India. But Lincoln, what he does that's brilliant, he doesn't use a club. He calls for the volunteers. He doesn't address it, and his counterpart is actually a very interesting character, Jefferson Davis, and probably worthy of some type of discussion cast. And I haven't really searched for anything. um, Lincoln Davis was hoping that this would be settled in the courts because he felt that secession was an inherent right built into the Constitution, that it maybe, it's not inherently mentioned, but the idea is that, the concept of free association and popular sovereignty are big ideas. And I think he wanted to become a court case, and Lincoln didn't want to, so the idea that Davis is kind of going, all we ask is that you leave us alone. We're not going to go after you. And that was Davis's stand, and hopefully get it sorted out through a court situation. He actually stayed in, after Mississippi made their intention known, he stays in Washington, D.C., and he's hoping to get arrested. But he's not arrested, which is, again, Lincoln used some shrewdness there and also didn't overreact. He had his hand of cards and he was playing it very well. So what Lincoln does is he baits the South into firing the opening shots, which totally changes the tenor of the war. If the Union had marched on Richmond, or if they had marched on Montgomery when Montgomery was the provisional capital, and invaded, they're suddenly now the aggressors. And what he did by reinforcing, not launching operations out of Sumter, he really baits the South into the Civil War by not arresting Davis when he could have at any time done it. His state had seceded. He had written quite a bit of the parts for the secession. He gave an oration in the Senate about it. He could, it's understandable that many presidents, I think a Jackson would have arrested him. Lincoln doesn't. So this is really shrewd. Now, he is going to push the envelope on the Constitution. I don't think he pushes it as far as Jackson did, I think it's more of because it's not in the Constitution that it is in the Constitution that in times habeas corpus can be suspended, or it's understandable. But he pushed it. He really did push it. But again, he didn't overplay his hand. He didn't, he kept them out of sight and out of mind. So he's very shrewd in dealing with his adversaries, and this now goes to his cabinet. He has this, the idea, like a team of rivals in his cabinet. They were all his rivals for the Republican nomination, which had evolved. He's the first Republican president and first Republican. And it had evolved out of the Free Soil movement. And a lot of the people who were his rivals, he has them into his cabinet. So he's maybe taking a page. It's almost Machiavellian how he works, and I don't say that as a derogatory thing. When Machiavelli talks about how to deal with your adversaries and either destroy them or keep them close and promote them slowly so they don't get, keep them on a leash. And or Michael Corleone School of Leadership, keep your friends close but your enemies closer. And because he knows that these are working together with him, but they're also rivals, and they thought they could do the job better than Lincoln. So he's surrounded by these circumstances, and yet he manages to do it. And the wear and tear obviously shows it. I mean, if you look, we've all probably looked at pictures of him from when he's in 1860 and what he looks like shortly before his death. And his assassination is probably, I think, the greatest tragedy in this nation. We don't know what this nation would be like had his plans for Reconstruction. And he had said, I'm going to go easy on him. He wanted to have He wanted to have reconciliation, not reconstruction. That was his plan. Um, one of his plans was that if a territory or state, once 10% of the people who had, if they, who had, joined the movement, I think it was 10% of 10,000. I'm sorry that I'm not sure, but it was a sizable number, probably 10,000. Once they had taken an oath of loyalty, that they would be welcomed back into the fold of statehood and have the constructs of representation and things like that. And I think that, and actually Johnson wants to carry that on. Johnson has other issues. Um, some of the negatives, he definitely baits the South into the Civil War, but I don't see that as a negative. He put the South in a position that they had to fire the first shot. He was not going to do it, and the South took the bait, but the South had to now because, and he just did an unexpected move. The move that the South did was they seceded, and they were not. They're saying just leave us alone. We don't want any harm. He doesn't make an aggressive move per se to the South, but by reinforcing Sumter, the South has to respond to that because he would respond and go to other locations, and he picked the place in the sea. It's a really great move. Um, and obviously the South takes the bait and they open the hostilities firing on Fort Sumter, and then Lincoln can go ahead. Now, Lincoln early in the war, one of a legitimate criticism is as commander in chief, he is not particularly good. He really gets onto a situation where he vilifies McDowell at Bull Run, and McDowell had a sound plan. It just was beyond the capacity of volunteers who were new to do, and also the Confederates got some really good, movement in the right location at the right time. They got the reinforcements at the right place, and General Jackson's role has been an area of discussion, but that's where he earns the term Stonewall. But the defense of the South and their counterattack was very good, and it was just a situation that Beauregard was better than Beauregard's. The fate and his plan was as good, and his execution was a little bit better than McDowell's. I think Burnside is kind of burned at the stake by Lincoln, and Burnside had served the Union well. He did a decent job in Antietam. Wasn't great, but he did what he needed to do at the bridge. He didn't botch it. When he was probably not the best person to be put as commander of the Army of the Potomac, but he's also really hurt by logistics. And Burnside is kind of, Maurice Heights kind of does him in. And the other one I think is treated rather badly by him is Meade. Meade is probably one of the top commanders in the Union Army, taken as a whole. He certainly did an amazing job at Fredericksburg, where he attacked Jackson and did well. He also, at Gettysburg, he had only been in command for a few days, and he really moved and constructed his army well. And honestly, to Lee was a very dangerous commander. He had been beaten, but he could still launch a terrible blow if he needed to, and he wasn't running for his life. He retreated in good order back to the Potomac, and they had been through a lot of the territory. There were plenty of good places where they could have parked if Meade had been aggressively pursuing them and had another battle, and both sides had been worn out. So I think Meade acted, and also the corps that he had was the last reserve of the Union Army. It was the last reserve of this nation. And was he going to risk it on a fast movement and trying to catch a army that was still very capable? So I think his meddling, you could say he meddled a lot with McClellan. McClellan very arguably deserved it, because he had built this amazing army, trained it very well, given them a sense of pride, but he didn't want to use it. And then once he finds Grant, he has someone he can go with. I also think he trusted in Halleck too much. That's just my opinion. Others would disagree. But I don't think of him as a great commander in chief with the handling of the army. He micromanaged. And I think I don't think it ended the cause. I don't think it changed the course of the war very much. I think Grant proved himself to be the right man because he understood the mathematics of the war, and he was able to, and Lincoln stood by him with the high casualties that Grant had to sustain to fight a purely offensive war, and a war of maneuver and engagement, maneuver and engagement, maneuver and engagement for the year or so that Grant was in command of the Army of the Potomac. So I think he learned his lesson. It took him a while to learn, but he learned it. The worst one, I think, was Meade. Meade was a very able commander and arguably saved the nation, because if the South wins at Gettysburg, it's a very different story, but that might be a different cast. Talk about Gettysburg. So the other thing, obviously, is a political move that he does during the wars of 13, as the Emancipation Proclamation, which is just sheer genius. It's absolutely sheer genius, and it doesn't it doesn't free any slaves that are in the border states, or it doesn't free any slaves that are, in it doesn't do that. It doesn't free the slaves. It just basically, it's a military proclamation, and the army, if they come apart and they get something, they can, if a state that's in rebellion, that those slaves are freed, but it's up to the army to do it. So it kind of gave a little bit of impetus, I think, abolitionists within the Union Army, and there were a sizable amount of abolitionists in there. A lot of people, I think, just were fighting to save the Union. I'm not sure. I agree with some historians who say that it ennobled the war. I don't see a lot of evidence of that. I think it made abolitionists felt they were recognized, and it gave them some pep in their step about it. But it's a brilliant move. I mean, tactically, it's a brilliant move, and it changes the complexion and the conversation of the war. And he had held his own at the Union Army had held its own at Antietam, a battle that they should have routed the Confederates at, given the circumstances of that battle. And it's just sheer genius. And of course, the 13th Amendment it's the fulfillment of the Constitution, the Declaration and Constitution. And it's not the fulfillment, it's not, but it's addressing the original sin of this republic. It truly is. It addresses it, and it doesn't sugarcoat it. I want to talk about one other thing that I think is among the greatest acts of legislation, is the Homestead Act. And it's lost in of course, the drama and the importance of the Civil War. But the Homestead Act, I think, is one of the most brilliant bits of legislation, because it deals with an area of topic that people are very uncomfortable today, and it really gives us insight into Lincoln's political mind, and it's land reform. And every revolution in world history, and you can go back, to more modern revolutions, or go back to revolutions that were times of our contemporary, and even some before. Land reform is a big part, usually, of a sign of a successful revolution. And the idea is that having property and getting people invested in the soil of the land is giving them a stake in the country. And the Homestead Act, to me, is one of the most important American ideas, and it was totally taken over by other interests through corruption. But the idea of making people who had nothing and giving them the opportunity is really a very powerful act. It's not just a gesture, and it's unfortunate that it was taken advantage of by people who are very good at taking advantage of good public policy. Just an aside, so judging him on that's putting him, that's why he's going to be in the S category. It might be the GOAT. He and Washington are just amazing. And I think the construct is that when you're looking at slavery, you're definitely looking at a situation of class in society, and it's the absolute bottom rung. But when you look at economic situations, you have a lot of other people who were in that situation, and you're going to have a lot of freedmen who are going to be, destitute and ruined and can't stay. And you're going to have a lot of people whose lives have been ruined by this war, who are destitute and never really had much. I mean, the number of impoverished people who fought in the Union Army or who were still in these United States at that time, they can't afford land. And this is the opportunity. This is the promise of America. When you talk about life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, the construct of property is something to have a stake in this republic. So I think that's overlooked in the drama of the Civil War, and the idea that he was willing to go easy on the South, but he, I think, would have absolutely applied the 13th Amendment, and that's going to not happen so much under our next president, who is Andrew Johnson. So Johnson might be one of the most destructive presidents in history. And it's not all his fault, because he actually wanted to have one part from a kind of a different motive. I think Lincoln's idea is reconciliation of the South by having that, when a certain amount of people sign the loyalty oath, that they would be welcomed back into the fold. But it's also, he is going to make sure the 13th Amendment, with all that it entails, is going to be brought upon the South, and that's the carrot and stick, and it's going to change. The issue of slavery has been decided by arms, and now it's a law. And if you come back into the Union, and with all its benefits, you are recognizing the sovereignty of that law. Johnson he wants to do one part of Lincoln's thing of letting the South back into the fold, because he's Southern. He is not really anti-slavery, but he's pro-union. And he's not really, he's a very gruff personality, very irascible, doesn't get along with people, bombastic, not a good person to be at this time in history. So the man and the time are not good, and his inclinations just don't match. Although he does want to do one thing with Lincoln, but I think his motives are different, because he's intentionally sabotaging a lot of Lincoln's goals by the 13th Amendment and the construct of really having a change in the context and the construct of the South, and with regard to former slaves. And he is not at all inclined to help out the freedmen. He makes horrible decisions. One of the decision that he makes is he goes after Stanton, and Congress had passed the Office of Tenure, which basically gave protection to certain people, and Johnson vetoes it. He doesn't like it. Congress overrides his vetoes. Now, you have, the funny thing is, now Johnson is dealing with a Congress that's very different than the one that, Lincoln knew what he was going to be getting. And it was going to be a struggle to go easy on him, like he said, with this real radical vengeance-minded. There was a lot of vengeance involved, understandably, and also the abolitionists, which is not, that's the Lincoln part of it. But Lincoln was not going to have cakewalk going into his idea. But I think he had the gravitas, having won the war. He had the respect of a lot of people as winning this war, which a lot of people, which until 1864, it's not over. So when Johnson acts against the Act of Tenure and tries to get rid of Stanton, he opens the door to Congress, who don't like him anyhow. They really don't like Johnson. They were certainly, because again, the parts that they wanted, some of the things they wanted, he didn't want, and some things Lincoln wouldn't have done, they kind of wanted to, but I think Lincoln could have kept him under control, and Johnson couldn't. And Johnson just doesn't have the temperament to work with him, and the inclination. He doesn't play well in the sandbox. He sets African Americans, former slaves, back for a long time, with all the negatives about that Reconstruction brings about later on after Reconstruction period ends. This is Johnson's legacy, and he is impeached, and he's the first president impeached. He goes to trial. He's not convicted, so he can stay in office, but he's really ineffective after that, and he gets an F, a well-earned F. And let's go to Grant. Grant is was considered really lowish on the presidential list, and he's undergone a renaissance in recent years, and he's actually a pretty decent president. Um, he's trending up. One of the thing about Grant is from all personal, all correspondence. He's a really great guy. He's a very sensitive, kind man. Hates, they called him the butcher in the war, and he allegedly was sick at the sight of blood. Really, he kind of liked his horse. He was not a drunkard. He's definitely not a drunkard. He's the kind of guy, he would go on a binge or a bender, and he just could not hold his alcohol. He was the kind of guy, kind of person, you have one person, you give them one drink one drink and they're tipsy, two drinks, they're gone. And that was Grant. So it didn't take much for him to get drunk and stay drunk. But he was not necessarily like, constantly besotted. He really wasn't. He's a general. He's not, he's a general put into a different type of job, but he actually is not that bad. His problem is some people he trusted to do things, he didn't oversee them as much as he should have. So one thing that Grant does is he goes after the Klan, which rises very shortly after, and again because of the mixed policies of Reconstruction, the Congress really going after the South in a way that Lincoln probably didn't intend, and Johnson going after African Americans. The Klan starts making its head, and he goes after the South. He establishes the Department of Justice for a pretty good cause, to get rid of the Ku Klux Klan. His policies and his enforcement of Lincoln's intent and the 13th Amendment lead to record voting in the South that is going to dwindle as time goes on, and after he goes, because he really got on the program with that aspect of the 13th Amendment and Lincoln's plan. He also wants to look into Santo Domingo and expand the United States into Santo Domingo, which would have been a really interesting expansion. And again, if you don't like expansion, you don't like this. But one thing about Santo Domingo is primarily people who were non-white, natives and people who were descendants of African slaves who were in Santo Domingo. It's opposed by Sumner, and part of it, Sumner's reasons for opposing the acquisition or the annexation of Santo Domingo he felt it would further upset a nation's just coming over slavery and having a lot of issues regarding race in the nation. Sorry, we had to step away for real life for a second. But Santo Domingo is a very interesting thing. He does pass the Civil Rights Act of 1875, or pass with him. He opens up trade with Korea, which is pretty interesting. Korea is a kind of one of those downtrodden places. For years they've been pushed around by the Chinese and Japanese, and it's an interesting opportunity. One thing he does, he trusts his buddies from the army, and they start making errors in the Black Hills in the West, and that starts creating problems with the Sioux. Now, I'm not giving him a pass on this. You can delegate authority, but you can't delegate responsibility. So as commander-in-chief, with settlers and then the army not really responding in the way they were supposed to by treaty, it leads to real problems with the Sioux and other nations in the Great Plains and the Upper Plains. He's trusting his old buddies in the Civil War, and some of the things they say about Native Americans lets you know quite honestly how they felt about him, and this is a negative. It took a situation that was bad, and you already have a lot of hostility going on there, but you had some stability and made it worse, and it's going to get worse especially in that area of the country until it ends in Wounded Knee, which is a mark against the country. It was the interactions with tribal people and indigenous people, with all the diaspora that went on, with all the breaking of treaties, breaking of goodwill, is something this country has to look at. It's something that it just needs to be looked at as what it is, and many nations have this situation going on with indigenous people when they are establishing statehood. It doesn't change that it creates problems, that these behaviors, and Grant has to take some accountability for that. The passage of the 14th and 15th Amendment are also, though now back on the other side, those are huge amendments that change the way law goes about. He does civil service reform, and the cabinet does some takes some excessive actions. And again, because Grant was naive and trusting, and he had some decent subordinates, I think, in the Civil War who followed his orders and did what he expected them to do. And he was not a political animal so much. But he does some civil service reform, partly due to the excesses. And maybe he is the GOAT as far as a general of Civil War. I think you can make the claim that he is probably the genius and the best general that emerges from that war. But he's a pretty good president too. And he's kind of, again, risen from kind of low in the ratings. And I'm going to put him next to Polk, and he's a B. I think he's a pretty strong president that has a real solid of big legislation behind him that made the country better, and he followed in many ways Lincoln's intent on many of the big issues. So we're going to wrap it up on that note, and we'll be looking at a different group next time. We'll be looking at Hayes, who takes over after Grant, Garfield, Chester Arthur, and we'll probably go that far, maybe 3, and maybe we'll add Benjamin Harrison to the mix. These are post-Reconstruction presidents. Reconstruction weighs out, and it's officially ended. So this is the post-Reconstruction, and we're kind of entering into a second wave of industrialization in the United States. So you're going to start having a lot more issues with antitrust groups, labor rights, populism again is going to make its face. The farming aspects of, as the nation is changing from an agricultural nation that kind of Jefferson had dreamed about, to this more Hamiltonian country of industry and business and railroads and infrastructure. And it's going to be a different thing. Again, to summarize, I just want to say, I think that you have to have Washington up in this A list, and one of these two are high candidates to go up, and there'll be at least one more added, and I think that'll be it. I think Jefferson stays an A. He's good. He's an A, but he's not that above. The key feature is beginning of the country, most important phase, or the division of the country, the potential cessation of these United States as it was known. Key part. The next part is going to be a little bit later in the history, and it could be a couple things. You go through the World Wars, you go through the Depression, and then the World Wars, that era of the country, and how did it. The question I ask is, to what extent does it pose an existential threat to the nation as a state? What about the Cold War? Did the conflict and the hostility with Russia, the Cold War, if it ever became hot, how much did that pose an existential threat to the nation? I think that's going to determine whether or not someone in that third area is going to be, which one is it going to be, the World Wars or the Cold War? And the question that I'm asking myself, and I've answered it already, is which one was a more existential threat to the nation? And so I think the superior one, we know 2 of them, it's either going to be that period, either the World Wars or the Cold War, and that'll be where the third superior one. But we have a couple of days coming. We got some good presidents coming up. We got a couple of duds, and I look forward. And please, if you are enjoying this, please subscribe, hit a like button. I'm talking with a lot of friends of mine who are pretty knowledgeable about history and other topics of interest, and hoping to have just conversations about things, and a conversation between good friends who might not share the same views on different topics. And I think it'd be a worthwhile dialogue to have, and hopefully some of you might want to participate in it. So thank you. Have a wonderful day.